Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Let's have a little lesson on complex numbers. A complex number is written in the form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers. That's what you want to realize, that a and b are real numbers. A and b are real numbers. But this here is what we call a complex number that has a real part, and the real part of that complex number is a. And the imaginary part of that complex number is bi, where b is a real number. I is the imaginary number, and we learned that last week. And so I is the imaginary number, and we will review this tomorrow when I get back. And what the heck is I? Well, I is equal to the square root of -1. The imaginary number allows us to take the square root of a negative number. Therefore, I squared is equal to -1. And we'll use this fact a little bit later on in the video, because this is hard for some people to wrap their head around, because it's not new and it's not a normal thing to do, to be talking about imaginary numbers. But I wanted to start this lesson off with something easy, and the easy thing is to add complex numbers. Keep in mind, a complex number has two parts, a real part and an imaginary part. B, where a and b are real numbers, and I is this imaginary number. So here's an example of a complex number, 5 plus 3i. 5 is your real part, 3i is the imaginary part. 3 is a real number, I is the imaginary number. Here's another example here, -7 minus 2i. Here's your real part, here's your imaginary part. Okay, pretty straightforward. You can't add those. When you're adding complex numbers, you're going to treat the I just like a variable, and it's fairly easy. So you're going to just look at I as just think about I as being an X or a Y. Look at I as just like an X or a Y, and we've added like terms before. So if I'm going to add 2 plus 3i, this complex number, to this complex number 4 minus 5i, all you do is add the real parts and you add the imaginary parts, just like you would if you were going to add x's and x squareds and numbers. So what do you do here? You just add the real parts, 2 plus 4, and you add the imaginary parts, 3i plus -5i. Well, 2 plus 4 is 6, 3i minus 5i is -2. So, and most students eventually will be able to look at this and say, oh, that's just 6 minus 2i, without writing these steps. It would be the exact same, and don't forget this, as doing something like this. 2 plus 3x plus 4 minus 5x, which is what? 6 minus 2x. So just treat the I as a variable, because it is a variable. But it's a very special variable. It's the variable that is equal to the square root of -1, and I squared is equal to -1. So let's do some more examples about adding complex numbers. So, okay, so what I'm doing is helping you with IXL, I2, and we'll get to I1. I1 is going to be a little bit more difficult than I2, but I2 is going to be straightforward. So here, these are some examples straight off of IXL, I2, straight off. Here's your example 1. I have 3i minus 2i plus 5i. Well, you just add up the i's. 3 minus 2 is 1, plus 5 is 6i. Here's another example, straight off the IXLs. So we got 1/2 plus 2i plus 3 minus 4i. So you're going to add the real parts, 1/2 plus 3, and then you're going to add the imaginary parts, 2i, -4i. 2i minus 4i is -2i, and 1/2 plus 3. 3, you know, is 6 halves. 1 half plus 6 halves is 7 halves. So not too awful bad. Let's see here. Is there any other IXLs that I'd like to do here? Oh, I think I have another example here. So here's another one right off of the, don't get tripped up by this right here. Here's another example where I have negative 8i over 15 plus negative 4/3 minus 2i. Well, the first thing you do is pick out the real part. Well, this particular complex number, the real part is 0. You don't see him. He's over there, but you don't see him. So what is 0 plus negative 4/3? Just 4/3. So really, all you're left to do is you're adding this and you're adding the imaginary parts. Okay, so don't forget the negative 4/3. You have to write him out here, negative 4/3. And now you're simply adding this, negative 8i over 15 and negative 2i over 5. Well, how do you add fractions? To add fractions, you have to have common denominators. And 15 is a multiple of 5. So what are we going to do here? You know what we're going to do. We're going to multiply that by 3 over 3, 1. 3 times 2i is 6i. 3 times 5 is 15. Now that allows me, if you will, to add the negative 8i and the negative 2i, which is going to be negative ai over 15 minus 6/15 i. And this is going to be negative 4/3 plus negative 14/5 I. So there's some tricky ones towards the end of I2, but I2 should be very doable. And if you look at your agenda, notice that your home, I'm not taking any formal assignments. Your assignment is your IXLs. So I would be getting on those before next Sunday evening. Okay, you'd be a silly head to wait for that long. So now let's talk about some IXLs I1. These are a bit tricky, and then this does deal with what I talked about in the video last week about the elephant in the room. Once you get, and this, I will tell you, this takes a while to get your head wrapped around. Same thing I had on the first page there. So we're talking about just the imaginary number I. Well, what is I? I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. We're going to use this down the road. This part of the definition is this part right here. This is the part that we're going to use today. Okay. So if I have this example, here's an example. Square root of negative 5. How do I simplify that? Well, the square root of negative 5 is negative 1 times 5. Well, what's the square root of negative 1? I. So this is simply I square root of 5. And don't forget, we're using this property of radicals where you have a square root of b is equal to the square root of a times b. Works the same thing for imaginary numbers, because negative 5, what is negative 5? Negative 1 times 5. So if you remember this, negative 1, if you remember this, you should be able to do these, because negative 5 is negative 1 times 5. What's the square root of negative 1? I. What about this rascal? Okay, well, the first thing I would do with this, let's do this example right here. Keep in mind, if I'm going a little bit too fast, that you can always pause the video. Pause the video, get collected with your notes. I definitely would be taking notes. Again, you're a silly head if you don't. Okay, so how are we going to do this with the square root of negative 18? Well, start off with, that is going to be the square root of negative 1 times square root of 18. What's the square root of negative 1? I. But we're not finished with that, because we know from, I don't know, we did this earlier in the semester, and you did this in geometry, where you simplified radicals, and we did some of this. Square root of 18 is not simplified. Well, what's square root of 18? Square root of 18 is square root of 9 times 2, square root of 2. And what's the square root of 9? 3. So here I have, so square root of negative 18 is I. times 3 times square root of 2. And the way we're going to write that is 3I square root of 2. Okay. What about this example? Square root of negative 16. Well, what the heck is that? First thing I'm going to do is pull that negative 1 out. It's going to be the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16. We know what the square root of negative 1 is. That's I. Square root of 16 is 4. So this is going to be 4I. And don't make this more difficult than it is. Don't forget what you already know. I will tell you it's going to take, and you're going to have to practice on this. I'm a little bit concerned that I'm not assigning homework, but what's really nice, and a lot of you have not been doing this, you should be doing this, is if you get something wrong in an IXL, it's going to walk through the steps with you. I guarantee you that some of you are, but then I also would guarantee you that some of you are not. I mean, I purposely get wrong answers on IXL just so I can look at how they're demonstrating how to do the problem. So it's a good idea. Don't just, and some of you are spending, if you're spending less than 10 minutes on IXL, you're not studying it. The IXLs are a way to study the material. Okay, so take some time on this. All right, so here's another example. Negative square root of negative 3. Well, this just means I've got this negative out here. And what's the first thing I'm going to do is just deal with this square root of negative 3, which is square root of negative 1 times square root of 3. So what's the square root of negative 1? I. So this is simply negative I square root of 3. Okay? And it's good to get your head wrapped around this because there are several problems like this on any formal assessment such as the ACT or SAT. All right, let's see if we have another example here. All righty. Ooh. This particular example, what they're doing towards the end of this IXL is they're leading you down the road to complex numbers. This doesn't look like a complex number as you just look at it. It doesn't look complex. It is complex. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to simplify this guy right here, negative 7, square root of negative 7, which is square root of negative 1, square root of 7, square root of negative 1 is I, square root of 7. Oh, so this is indeed a complex number because I have a real part, negative 15, and I have this imaginary part. And most of the time, you're going to see a plus bi. If it's a square root, they're probably going to want you to write the I first. But this is the same thing as this. But usually, the general convention is to write any variables in front of the square root so you don't think it's part of the square root. Okay? And that, again, is a complex number. Oh, let's see here. Alrighty. So let's do a couple more here. Let's simplify this bad boy. Well, what do you got? First thing you're going to do is take care of that negative, and you're going to write that as negative 1 square root of negative 1 times square root of 75. This guy here is I, but I notice, keep in mind, this radical, there's a perfect square in there, so I need to simplify that. And this is old school. This is a previous lesson. That's going to be the square root of 25 times the square root of 3, because 3 times 25 is 75. Square root of 25 is 5. So this is going to be I, 5, square root of 3. And the proper way to write this then would be 5I square root of 3. So that's a little short 15-minute video that will get you started on those couple IXLs. Keep in mind, I'll be back tomorrow to do some more complex and to go over this. I strongly suggest that you take notes. Hello. Take notes over this video. It's posted. You might want to watch this video again. Take notes and begin working on your IXLs. And you have some time left in this class. Begin working on, and today I would work on IXL, I1, and I2, and you have good examples for those. All righty. I will see you soon.